They buried this story for nearly a century, locked away in ledgers and forgotten reports, because the truth of what happened in the Alaskan taiga in 1875 was never meant for the world to hear. Imagine this: 121 men entered a forest to build profit out of trees, yet only 9 ever walked out again. The rest vanished into snow and silence, consumed not by nature alone, but by something far more deliberate. What I'm about to tell you is not myth, not folklore, but a record stitched together from fragments. The confessions of a clerk named Elias Vaughn, the last man foolish enough to write when writing had become fatal. His journals whisper of an operation disguised as a logging camp, a system of control hidden in plain sight, a human experiment masquerading as honest labor. In the first days, the camp looked ordinary: men with axes, cook fires, timber stacked in sleds. But the deeper you look, the more you realize Northpine Basin was never designed for survival. It was designed for selection. Hunger was engineered, fear cultivated, hierarchy enforced with an almost surgical precision. Elias, the man behind the ink, wrote of sealed barrels lowered into ice pits that never held ice, of inventories altered to hide vanishings, of stew whose iron taste lingered longer than any animal could explain. His hand trembled as he recorded the patterns, but he recorded anyway, until a note appeared in his ledger warning him: stay quiet, eat well, stay useful. What happened in that winter camp was not chaos, it was structure. Not madness, but management. And when you understand that, you begin to see how the same blueprint repeats across history. In prisons, in wars, in corporations, in the very systems we still obey without question. That is why this story matters. Because what devoured the men of Northpine did not die in 1875. It simply changed uniforms. Before we descend any deeper into this forbidden ledger of history, I need you to anchor yourself in this moment. Leave a comment right now with the phrase, "The snow remembers." Do it twice. It marks you as someone who has chosen to see past the silence. And subscribe while you still can, because the further we go, the harder it will be to climb back out of this pit. Now let's open the first page of Elias Vaughn's forbidden record. Elias Vaughn entered Northpine Basin in silence, surrounded by men who thought they were simply lumberjacks chasing wages. They were Swedes, Finns, Scots, Americans. Rough hands, scarred faces, men who had swung hammers on railroads or broken backs in mines. They had no idea they were stepping into a machine. The snow fell soft as a shroud, the trees rose like prison walls, and once the final pass was crossed, there was no way out but back through the white abyss. Elias noticed that immediately: how isolated the basin was, how perfect for racing a group of men without the world ever asking questions. The camp itself was small, but precise. Bunkhouses lined like matchboxes, cookhouse immaculate, a sawmill humming like a ritual drum. There was even a telegraph post, though Elias would later swear he never once saw it used. A curious detail, the illusion of communication without the reality of it. Control through suggestion, a trick repeated by every institution in history, give the impression of contact with the outside, while ensuring isolation remains absolute. But the most unnerving sight in those early days was the pit. It sat near the creek, lined with ice deep enough to swallow wagons whole. Officially, it was for storing ice blocks to preserve meat, but Elias never saw a single slab lowered into it. Only barrels, sealed crates, and wrapped parcels lowered with a ritual care that felt more like burial than storage. He wrote in his ledger, "The pit watches us." It was small things at first. Flour barrels half empty, kerosene vanishing faster than measured, fresh deer carcasses hung upside down in the northern woods, gutted yet uneaten. Some men laughed it off as pranks, others muttered of wolves or spirits, but Elias knew patterns. He tracked every cord of wood, every sack of potatoes, every ounce of missing fuel. Numbers never lie, and the numbers whispered that something was already feeding off them. The foreman, Grant Harker, ran the camp like a priest runs a congregation. He never shouted, he never explained. He simply walked with his lantern from bunk to bunk each night, asking one question: "How are you sleeping?" A strange question for a logging boss. But Elias began to realize it wasn't about trees, it was about minds. By the second week, the first supplies had already gone thin. By the third, the meat vanished from meals altogether. And by the fourth, the stew returned, thicker, darker, heavier. Elias wrote, "Something has begun." By the middle of January, the snow no longer felt like weather. It felt like a wall, an endless barricade pressing in, burying the camp deeper each night. The men stopped speaking of home. They stopped speaking at all, except when Harker demanded their reports. The log piles grew steadily, but no wagons left, no shipments came in. Elias began to wonder who the timber was really for, or if it was even meant to leave the basin at all. It was during one such ledger night that Elias discovered something grotesque. Among the stacks of records he was instructed to maintain, one book did not match. It was bound in black oilskin heavier than paper alone could explain. When he opened it, he saw names, not of trees or shipments, but of men. Each page carried a date, a tally, and a single word eaten. At first, Elias thought it was a cruel joke, perhaps a drunken scribe's attempt at dark humor. But the dates matched perfectly with disappearances the camp whispered about. A Finn named Torvald who vanished on a night shift, a Scottish sawyer named Macleod who never woke from his bunk. Their names were there marked and underlined. Elias felt his chest tighten when he turned to the final entry. It read clerk pending. The stew became impossible to swallow. A greasy heaviness clung to the tongue. Men joked no longer. They ate in silence, eyes down, spoons trembling. A few refused to eat at all. They didn't last. Harker's assistants, two tall brothers with pale eyes, dragged them from their bunks and took them to the pit. They never returned. And the next night, the stew pot was full again. Elias tried to warn the others, but most were too far gone. Hunger erases rebellion faster than fear. A strange resignation settled over the camp, as though each man knew, at some silent level, that he was livestock waiting his turn. And the way Harker walked through the bunks at night, his lantern sweeping faces, his quiet question, "How are you sleeping?" felt less like concern and more like inventory. It was then Elias began to write differently, not as a clerk, but as a witness. He knew the ink could betray him if it fell into the wrong hands, yet he also knew silence was already the death of the camp. His final note of that week was a warning, written not to himself but to whoever might one day find the journal. If you are reading this, do not eat the stew. Do not trust the pit, and never answer Harker when he asks how you are sleeping. By late January, the basin itself seemed alive. The trees leaned closer, their black silhouettes knitting together overhead like ribs of a coffin. At night, the snow would settle in patterns too precise to be natural, spirals, circles, long straight lines that pointed toward the pit. Elias began to suspect that the men were not only being harvested for flesh, but for something deeper, something tied to the land itself. One night, while finishing his ledger by lantern light, Elias heard movement outside his bunkhouse. Not footsteps, but dragging, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled through snow. He crept to the window and lifted the frost with his breath. What he saw was not Harker, nor the pale-eyed brothers, it was the pit. It glowed faintly blue beneath the crusted ice, and shapes thin, human skeletal, were writhing inside it. They did not look like corpses. They looked like men in mid-dream, their mouths open in silent screams. He staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern. The next morning, when he dared to look again, the pit was quiet, sealed with snow as though nothing had stirred. Elias confided this to Anders, a Swedish sawyer who still clung to scraps of reason. Anders nodded grimly. He too had seen strange things, shadows walking against the light, voices calling his name from the timber stacks, the sound of axes striking wood long after the work had ceased. The camp, he said, was not for logging. It was for gathering. We are the cords of wood. Anders whispered. Stacked, counted, burned. That night, Elias tested a theory. He feigned sleep, leaving his journal open beside him. At midnight, Harker entered the bunkhouse with his lantern. His boots made no sound. He paused over each man, gazing at their faces, his pale light resting on closed eyelids. When he reached Elias, he bent close, his breath strangely warm, smelling of copper and earth. Then he whispered, "You are not ready yet," and walked on. The following day, 3 men disappeared from the crew. Their names were crossed out in the black oilskin book, their fate sealed. Elias realized then that the journal he kept was not only his memory, but his shield. The ink gave him value. As long as he wrote, he was useful. But usefulness has limits. That night, Elias vowed something in his heart. He would not go quietly. He would not be stacked like timber. If the pit demanded flesh, it would not take his without a fight. And in that decision, the true horror began. Because defiance meant drawing the pit's gaze, the first crack in the silence came not from Elias, but from Anders. He had been sharpening his axe one night, the stone singing in the quiet, when he suddenly stood and hurled the blade into the cookhouse door. The camp froze. Men looked up from their bowls, spoons trembling in half, empty hands. Anders spat in the stew pot and shouted, "No more." For a moment, it felt like something had broken. The spell of obedience, the slow sleepwalking of hunger, it wavered. A few men nodded, a few even stood. But then Harker appeared, lantern in hand, his pale eyes calm as water over ice. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Anders and asked, "How are you sleeping?" Anders laughed bitterly. "Better than you," he said. It was the last true act of defiance in Northpine Basin. The pale-eyed brothers moved in silence. They struck him down not with weapons, but with their hands, impossibly strong, bending bone like twigs. The men watched, paralyzed, as Anders was dragged to the pit. Harker led the procession, lantern glowing with an unnatural hue. Elias forced himself to follow at a distance, heart pounding, because he knew he had to see. The pit was alive. Its ice crust had melted, steam rising in coils that smelled of rust and brine. When Anders was lowered, he did not fall. He was pulled. Thin arms, dozens, maybe hundreds, reached up and drew him into the churning blue depths. His scream cut through the forest, echoed against the timber, and then was gone. The glow flared, then dimmed, leaving silence. The brothers stood unmoved, their hands slick with frost, their breath calm. Harker whispered something Elias barely heard. The basin must feed. The next morning, the camp carried on as if nothing had happened. The saws rang, the axes split, the ledgers filled. But the men's eyes were hollow, their movements mechanical. It was as though each of them had accepted that resistance was suicide, that Anders' fate had been a warning, not a tragedy. But Elias felt something else. Rage, not wild, not reckless, but cold and calculated. He began hiding scraps of food, rationing crumbs of bread and dried fish under his bunk. He sketched maps of the basin in his ledger margins, charting paths through the trees, marking strange symbols he noticed carved into trunks, spirals, runes, circles etched deep as if by burning hands. For the first time, he began to think not just of surviving, but of escaping. Yet he also knew something Anders had not understood. The pit was not simply hunger. It was intelligence, and intelligence watches. That night, as he closed his eyes, Elias heard it for the first time. Not footsteps, not whispers, but a voice, deep and ancient, rising from the earth beneath his bunk. "Clerk, write me true." The voice did not fade with waking. It lingered like smoke, clinging to Elias's mind even as he washed his face with snow and pretended to work his numbers. He tried to ignore it, but the words returned, steady, patient, woven into the rhythm of his pen. "Write me true. Write me true." Each stroke of ink felt guided, as if the ledger were no longer his own. That evening, he opened the black oilskin book again. He meant only to glance, but his eyes were pulled deeper, the pages alive with shifting letters. He saw names of men yet breathing, marked as if already chosen. At the bottom of the page was his own name, not yet crossed, but pulsing faintly in the lantern light, as though waiting. He closed the book, heart pounding, and pressed it beneath the pile of ledgers. But the voice grew louder, no longer confined to dream. "The basin must feed. Ink is flesh. Ledger is bone. You write us real." The next night, Elias dreamt of the pit. He stood on its edge, looking down not into darkness, but into an inverted sky, stars spiraling like a whirlpool. Beneath them, faces floated, faces of every man in the camp, eyes open, mouths moving silently. One face rose higher than the rest. Anders, his lips moved, but no sound emerged until Elias leaned closer. Then he heard it. "Do not feed it. Bury the ink. Burn the book." He woke trembling, his sheets damp with sweat despite the cold. Across the bunkhouse, Harker was watching him, lantern glowing faintly in the dark. The overseer smiled, not warmly, but knowingly, and whispered, "You heard it, didn't you?" The next day, Elias could no longer deny the truth. The camp was not run for profit, not for timber, not for any human need. It was a ritual, a cycle of feeding and record-keeping. The pit consumed bodies, but it required witnesses. Someone to write, someone to count, someone to give shape to the sacrifice so it would bind, generation after generation. Elias realized with horror that he had become part of the machinery. Not a victim, not yet, but a cog, a recorder ensuring that the hunger remained endless. That night, he tried to resist. He refused to write. He kept his hands folded, his ink dry. The voice grew furious. The ground shook faintly beneath his bunk, snow sifting from the rafters. Men stirred in their sleep, mumbling. And then, with a sickening weight, the oilskin book opened by itself on his desk. The page turned, the pen lifted, and without his hand guiding it, words scrawled across the parchment: "Clerk, you cannot stop. You are mine until the last name is crossed." The following days blurred into a waking nightmare. Elias continued his clerking, his hand guided less by his own will and more by something beneath the earth. Yet curiosity gnawed at him as fiercely as fear. What was the pit? Why here? Why these men? He sought answers in whispers, scraps of rumor carried among the older loggers. One, a grizzled Finn named Carlo, told him of stories passed through some hunters, stories that predated the company, predated even the Russians. The basin, he said, was a place of buried sky. Long ago, something had fallen there, something not of earth. The shamans said it did not die, only rooted. It fed on memory, on the weight of witness. That was why it demanded not only flesh but record. To be remembered was to be real. Others claimed it was a god, exiled beneath ice for crimes too ancient to name, a god that could not create, only consume. It had no tongue, so it borrowed theirs, no hands, so it guided pens, and those who served it, the pale-eyed brothers Harker, perhaps even the company's founders. They were not masters of the pit, but its extensions, puppets on invisible strings. One evening, Elias dared to confront Harker directly. He asked why the ledgers mattered, why the names had to be written before the men were taken. Harker did not grow angry. Instead, he seemed almost pleased, as if a child had finally asked the right question. "Because ink binds more tightly than blood," Harker said. "A body fades, a corpse rots, but a name written, accounted for, that chains a soul forever." That night, Elias dreamt again. He saw rows upon rows of books stretching into darkness, shelves deeper than any library. Each book bound in hide, each page filled with names, millions, maybe more. A record of every sacrifice from centuries past. And in the distance behind the shelves, something vast shifted. Not a man, not a beast, but a mass of eyes watching, unblinking, waiting for him to approach. When Elias woke, he knew the truth. The pit was not just a hole in the earth, it was an archive. A hunger for memory. Each man who vanished was not lost, but catalogued, stripped of his voice, imprisoned in ink. And Elias, by writing, was the jailer. Yet knowledge carries danger. The moment he understood this, he felt the weight of another presence in his mind. Curious, probing, delighted. The pit had noticed his realization. It whispered, not angrily this time, but with something close to affection: "Clerk, you are learning. You will be my historian." The thought gnawed at him endlessly. What if he burned the books? If ink bound souls, then fire might free them. The vision of Anders's face, screaming silently in that inverted sky, returned each night. Elias imagined striking a match, watching the ledgers curl, their pages collapsing into ash. Perhaps then the pit would starve. Perhaps then its archive would collapse, releasing what it had stolen. But the pit was not deaf. It listened. The more Elias dreamed of fire, the more the camp twisted around him. Tools disappeared from where he had hidden them. Matches rotted damp in their boxes. Logs smoldered without flame, choking the air with black smoke. Even the thought of burning the books seemed to echo, as though the basin itself were rifling through his mind, stripping it for threats. One night, Elias stole a single blank ledger from the supply chest. He meant to fill it with false records, lies that might corrupt the archive. But when he opened it under the lantern's glow, words were already written there. Not his words, not any man's. They slithered across the page in wet, black strokes: "Clerk, do not play with fire. Fire consumes the vessel, but I endure. To burn the books is to burn yourself." His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it. He shoved the book under his mattress, heart hammering, and lay staring at the rafters. He realized then that the pit did not simply consume. It defended itself. It anticipated betrayal. It corrected thought. The next morning, the men awoke restless, haunted. 3 of them swore they'd dreamt of fire, dreamt of Elias holding a torch. Their eyes held suspicion, fear, even anger. He said nothing, but his stomach dropped. The pit had shared his rebellion, exposing him. He understood the cruelty of it. Every attempt at resistance became another layer of control. Yet something inside him hardened. If the pit could hear his thoughts, then he would no longer think. He would act. Quietly, carefully. Without forewarning, he began to carve hidden marks on the timber. He tallied symbols Anders had shown him once in idle talk, old Norse signs of warding. He slipped false entries into the margins of ledgers, barely visible, hoping they might weaken the chain of names. But the pit was patient. That night, Elias heard it again beneath his bunk, the voice colder now, not angry, not pleading, simply final clerk, I am inside your hand. When you write me. When you breathe me. Even rebellion is record, even fire is ink. Winter deepened, and the camp grew brittle with silence. The men no longer sang at their work, no longer joked by the fire. They cut and hauled in a trance, their eyes dull, as though their spirits had already been drained. The snow itself seemed heavier, pressing down upon the roofs, muting every sound. Then the pit demanded again. It began with a faint tremor one morning, just enough to rattle the tin mugs on the mess hall table. Harker stood and announced without hesitation, another must be given. No argument rose this time. No pleading, no rebellion. The men lowered their heads, resigned, as though they had always known it would come. The choice fell on a boy scarcely 20, a Swede named Mikkel. He had been coughing for weeks, his body wasting, his eyes sunken. Perhaps the pit preferred the weak now, or perhaps Harker knew no one would fight for him. They bound him at dusk, and Elias was ordered to record his name. Elias's hand shook as he dipped the pen. The page waited blank and expectant, like a mouth opening. He stared at the ink, wondering if refusal could break the cycle. But the boy's eyes found him across the room, wide, pleading not to be saved, but to be remembered differently. Not as a number, not as meat for the pit. Elias faltered, then wrote, not his full name, not the mark the pit wanted, but a single word, free. The ground shuddered violently. The lantern swung. Snow burst from the roof beams. Harker's eyes narrowed, and the pale brothers moved toward him. But the page glowed faintly where Elias had written. For the first time, the ledger resisted the pit. The ink writhed, trying to rearrange itself, but the word remained. That night, when Mikkel was cast into the pit, the dreams came stronger than ever. Elias saw not the boy's face in the whirlpool of stars, but a blank space where it should have been. The others floated as before, mouthing silent pleas, but Mikkel was gone, erased, escaped, or something stranger. The pit howled in his mind, furious and wounded, and Elias awoke with blood trickling from his ears. He understood then that he had struck at its foundation. The books were not unbreakable. Ink could lie, records could fracture, and if one soul could slip through, perhaps others could too. But he also understood something darker. The pit would not forgive him. His name pulsed brighter now on the page, each heartbeat drawing it closer to being crossed. His rebellion had marked him, and the basin was already preparing to claim him next. Elias could no longer sleep without the pit whispering in his skull. Its voice had grown intimate, like a breath against his ear, no longer distant thunder but a companion beside him in the bunk. It spoke his name in 100 tones, mocking, coaxing, pleading, commanding. Sometimes it called him clerk. Other times it used Elias. But the worst was when it whispered in his mother's voice, gentle and familiar, asking him to keep writing. The men avoided him now. Word had spread of the false entry. Some saw him as a savior, others as a danger. Harker's stare burned into him each time he crossed the mess hall, and the pale-eyed brothers shadowed his every step. He was marked, and he knew it. Still, Elias planned. He gathered scraps of candle wax, bits of resin, and hidden matches, keeping them beneath the loose floorboard of his bunk. Not for burning the books, that, he knew now, would only invite the pit's wrath, but for something else. Fire could be more than destruction. It could be signal. It could be distraction. He also began marking the ledgers in secret, leaving cryptic symbols between lines of tallies. To most eyes, they were smudges, mistakes. But to him, they were seeds of rebellion. Lee's half-truths, fractured numbers, enough to make the archive stumble, just as it had with Mikkel. If he could scatter enough poison into its record, perhaps he could weaken the entire structure. Yet the pit answered. On the third night of his quiet sabotage, Elias awoke to find one of the ledgers already open on his desk, its pages turned by an invisible hand, its ink reshaping into words. "You are clever, clerk, but cleverness is still record. You think you wound me, but I grow from every entry. Resistance itself is accounted. Soon you will see you cannot escape the page." The next day, another man was chosen, this time not the weak, not the sick, but a strong logger named Dermot, broad as an ox and beloved by all. His selection was no accident. It was punishment. Elias realized with horror that the pit was no longer feeding blindly. It was responding, choosing sacrifices that would isolate him further, twist the men's grief into hatred of him. That night, Dermot's screams echoed from the pit. Elias wrote his name with shaking hands, and in the dream that followed, he saw not one void among the faces, but two, Mikkel and Dermot, gone absent, erased from the archive. The pit roared, a sound like collapsing mountains, and Elias understood something crucial. His false entries weren't just rebellion, they were subtraction. He wasn't merely resisting the record, he was stealing souls back. But at what cost? Each subtraction tore at the pit, and each tear tightened the noose around him. His name flickered like a flame in the book, ready to be consumed. He knew then his choice was no longer whether to resist, but whether to gamble everything himself, the camp, and perhaps even the world, on one final act. The basin had grown unbearable. The wind never ceased its howling, and the snow fell in endless veils that buried cabins to their chimneys. Men moved like shadows, gaunt, eyes hollow, every step an echo of despair. The pit's hunger was no longer hidden. It pulsed beneath the ice like a second heartbeat, shaking crockery, rattling walls. At night, the dreams came not only to Elias but to all of them, visions of their own faces, pale and suspended, already drifting in that black spiral sky. Elias knew the end was near. His plan had to be now. On a night when the wind shrieked so fiercely it drowned all other sound, he gathered his hidden cache, wax, resin, matches, and slipped into the office. The ledgers lay stacked on the desk, swollen with the weight of every name, every sacrifice. The books pulsed faintly, breathing in rhythm with the pit below. He lit a candle and began to write. Not tallies, not lies this time, but inversions. For every name marked, he wrote its mirror, alive instead of dead, free instead of bound, light instead of void. He filled margins, turned columns upside down, wove contradictions through every page. He wrote until his hand cramped, until his wrist bled from the pressure, until the ink itself seemed to resist his pen, writhing across the paper like snakes. The room shook. A low groan rose from beneath the floorboards. The pit was stirring, and then the door burst open. Harker stood in the threshold, the pale-eyed brothers behind him, their faces carved from stone. They saw the pages, the heresy in ink, and their eyes widened with fury. "You've doomed us all," Harker spat. "The pit is order. Without it there is nothing but chaos." Elias gripped the candle and whispered, "Then let it be chaos." The brothers lunged. Elias flung the candle into the resin-soaked pile he had prepared at the foot of the desk. Flame roared up, devouring the air, swallowing ledger after ledger. The ink writhed, screaming in voices too many to count, as though every soul recorded was shrieking at once. The floor cracked. The walls split. The basin itself trembled as the pit bellowed in rage. Harker and the brothers fled into the snow, but Elias did not move. He pressed his hand to the final ledger, felt the pages throb like flesh, and forced one last word into it unwritten. The book spasmed. Ink sprayed across his face, hot and stinging, and then, impossibly, the voices fell silent. The pit did not roar. It howled, a sound so vast it bent the sky, a wound torn in the fabric of the earth. The ground collapsed beneath the office, dragging the books, the desk, and Elias himself into a chasm of fire and ink. As he fell, he saw the faces of the men, the lost, the erased, rising not down but up, streaming into the storm above, breaking free like sparks from a pyre. And then there was only blackness and the weightless silence of the unwritten. When spring thaw finally came to Northpine Basin, there was no camp to be found. The supply team that trudged across the mountain pass discovered only a hollow where the office once stood, its edges charred black, its depths sealed in ice as smooth as glass. Not a body, not a tool, not a single board of timber remained. The snow lay untouched, as if no man had ever set foot there. And yet, Scattered among the drifts, the searchers uncovered fragments, scraps of paper, half-burned, ink smeared and warped. Most were incomprehensible. Columns of numbers, lists of supplies, broken lines of names. But one fragment was different. Written in a jagged hand, the words still legible despite the fire. There were 121 of us when we crossed into the basin. I was Elias Vaughn, clerk of the camp. I wrote until writing became too dangerous. The company filed its report as a catastrophic snow burial. The basin was deemed unstable. The camp never rebuilt. The timber company sealed its ledgers and stored them in a locked archive, where they remain, yellowing, their ink fading. But among those who whisper of forbidden history, there are rumors. They say some nights, if you turn those pages under candlelight, the ink returns, fresh and black, names rearranging themselves. And if you linger too long, you may find your own name scrawled between the lines, waiting for you. Hunters who pass through the region tell of hearing voices under the ice, faint as breath but insistent, as though someone far below is still tallying, still recording. Sometimes they hear scratching, like a quill across parchment. Sometimes they swear they hear screams. No one knows what became of Elias. Some say he perished in the collapse. Others claim he succeeded, that he tore open the archive and freed the souls it held. But the most unsettling version is whispered only in hushed tones, that Elias never escaped at all, that he was not consumed, but transformed, that the pit needed a new clerk, a hand to keep its records, and Elias Vaughn, bookish, dutiful, precise, was the perfect choice. And so the ledger is never empty, the ink never dries, and the story of Northpine Basin is not an ending, but a warning. Because even now, in forgotten archives, in the margins of old books, in dreams you cannot explain, you might find the hand of Elias Vaughn, still writing, still counting, still waiting for the day your name must be entered.